Hey gamers, Aaron Shack here. I have a build for Hawkeye today, and we're calling it the Cosmic Clint build. Alright, let's take a look at Hawkeye's primary skill tree here and kind of just make sure that we understand some of the basics of the character. We have the light combo finisher, which is just hitting square 5 times, so let's try that. Cool. Pretty basic. You have the implosion arrow, which is holding square. You can also trigger this while in the air. There's an aerial version, which can be quite useful. You have the sweeping blade, which is a sprint attack, which does a little leg sweep, which can trip enemies. You have the ascending slash, which launches an enemy. You do that after dodging or evading. And then you have a triple slash that you can do in midair, which is also a light combo finisher. So that's a light combo finisher. Here's the sprint attack, which trips enemies. It's a great way to enter into combat. Plus that slide really gives you some cool momentum. And once you do that, you can just launch right into your combos. And that's the heavy combo finisher right there, but we'll get more into that once we get there. So yeah, I think that covers all of that. We have Gleaming Steel, which is hitting triangle 3 times. That's a kind of basic heavy combo finisher. Right? These are very powerful attacks. And they look really cool. Lots of flourishes, lots of tossing of the sword, all that kind of stuff. It makes him look really cool. Alright, split shot arrow and what we call bag of tricks here, which is sort of an evolution of the split shot arrow. Holding triangle allows you to do split shot arrow. We should also mention that splintering fire does like, it only fires 2 split shot arrows, but if you wanted to start off the bag of tricks with a split shot arrow from midair, then you can certainly do that. So let's look at that, because this is one of the most important moves that Hawkeye has. So doing it from midair, hold triangle, then you press triangle a couple more times, and you're doing different attacks. So let's analyze what's going on here. The first arrow is cryo, because that's what my current gear is. My current sword does split shot arrow, inflicts cryo damage. Then I have ranged attacks with cluster and pulsar arrows deal cosmic damage. So cluster arrows are these, and the pulsar arrows are these, which are remote detonated by pressing L2 and square. Right? Okay, but those arrows are also utilized in the bag of tricks. So it's actually very important to find gear here that utilizes tripwire shot and pulsar arrow, and then finding gear that also changes the element of your split shot arrows, because that makes bag of tricks. Obviously in this picture it's just firing the typical purple colored Hawkeye arrows that he likes to use by default, but now we're applying some special elements here. So the first one's cryo. There's the tripwire, which is doing cosmic. And then after that is the pulsar that does cosmic, and then back to more cryo, which is firing a lot more, right? So really cool, very powerful. We'll showcase that against some enemies once we do sort of some testing here. You have a sprint attack with triangle, and this causes your enemy to spin, so that's unstoppable blade. And then you have one that you can do while evading, and then we can look at the heavy attack, heavy combo finisher here, which launches targets in the air, deals continuous damage, keeps them suspended in the air, so that's launch damage, high damage, high impact, breaks block. It's very powerful, even if you're using it to like destroy things in the environment as well. If you're trying to destroy an objective, this can be a very powerful thing to destroy something. So the sprint attack, triangle, that's a very powerful opener. After dodging and hitting triangle, you have sort of that vertical swipe right there, which is excessive impact here. So that slams enemies, that knocks them down, and then you can go from there. That's a high impact attack there. Now looking at the heavy combo finisher, 2, 3, 4, 5. Boom. Now, you can potentially, depending on what type of arrows you have equipped, if you have something that affects the heavy combo finisher, and does a certain element, like say plasma or something, then that sort of tornado that appears there will change from, purple to red, for example, just depending on what you're using. So that can make that even more powerful. Staggering talent, you have a midair downwards sword slash there that's very good. Just to showcase that, obviously it's pretty cool. So you have a lot of options as a swordsman. But now let's look into range stuff, okay? So when we're firing the razor arrows, there's this thing called perfect draw, and I love this. So this adds 20% damage, high impact, plus 20% crit chance. So you definitely want to aim for the enemy's weak spot and really get those crits. Range combo finisher that has been perfectly drawn will inflict a stronger reaction, and it will stagger. So you notice here, it's sort of got this purple crosshair that's popping up, and you're releasing at the right time in order to get that perfect draw. So we got the razor arrows equipped. Once it turns purple, you notice if I charge it all the way, it turns yellow, and of course that does some heavy damage as well. But if I stop right when it turns purple, you notice the arrows will take off as purple. Yeah. So that's very powerful, and we're going to see some perks later on in the skill tree that will further explain that. With Deadeye here, you can aim and then hold down R2 until it's fully charged to enable the ability to mark an enemy by targeting them with the aiming reticle. The longer the enemy is targeted, the higher the targeting tier, up to a maximum of 2 tiers. Each tier increases damage and hit reaction severity. So charge times medium, breaks block, high damage, high impact, medium stun, also staggers and stumbles enemies. So this can be very powerful. So a fully charged razor arrow attack, and now you can up it to times 3 right there, which can be very powerful. Looking at the cluster arrows, it fires 3 energized arrows and does large amounts of stun damage. Once you fully charge it by holding down R2, it deals damage to anything it comes into contact with and trips the enemy. It also does like a wider radius of tripwire. So if we look at this, here's the basic cluster arrow, and then now if you do this, it's like really wide there. Look at that. It almost covers this entire, between these 2 columns here, it almost covers that whole area there. So I can use that to trip a lot of enemies and stun them and deal different types of damage here. Reduces the time it takes to fully energize cluster arrows by 30% and increases the range of tripwire shot by 50%. So that's very powerful. And obviously with our cosmic damage that we're dealing there, it's pretty amazing. Now looking at the last one, you have pulsar arrows, which I explained that these can be fired and then detonated by pressing L2 and square. And of course you kind of want to arc these because they're heavy arrows and they have to be drawn back. And so you have to kind of arc your shot if you're looking to hit an enemy. Because, like, obviously just a basic fire here is going to hit the ground. Whereas a fully charged shot, I can actually make sure that I hit that console right there. And then L2 and square to detonate. Or that would be left trigger and X on the Xbox controller. So that's very powerful. It's pretty cool. You can use it to almost sort of treat the arrows like mines. That can be really powerful. If you hold R2 until it's fully charged, you can actually pin enemies to surfaces. So that can be actually really good. And they'll just stay there until the arrow is detonated. Obviously, the larger enemies in the game cannot be pinned. But it does break block. It does high damage, high impact, and knocks enemies back, obviously. Looking here, they build up more energy after being fired. If you wait until the indicator light turns red before detonating the arrow to trigger an explosion, then inflicts increased damage. So there's sort of a little skill gap happening right here. And obviously that's quite a bit of wait time, you notice. That arrow sat there on that shield for quite some time before it turned red. But it can be very powerful, and it's a high skill gap right there to use that properly. So this breaks block, high damage, reactions to fly back. So now that we know all the arrow types, that's good information here. Now, of course, like all the other characters in the game, holding R2 to concentrate and focus on enemy movements, allowing for automatic quick dodging of basic enemy attacks. Dodging enemy attacks with Archer's Instinct consumes your intrinsic energy, which will replenish over time when not using the ability. Now, here's what gets fun is you can obviously parry using R2, and then you unlock these abilities here, like Startling Disruption. This is a very important attack here. So after parrying an enemy attack, you press square, and you jam a disruptor arrow into them, which applies the disruption debuff. Now, when we talk about Kate Bishop in her video, we will also talk about her version of disruption arrows. And this is kind of the only way that Hawkeye uses his. So if you want to be able to use disruption arrows as Hawkeye, you need to pay attention to this specific ability right here. So the debuff increases critical attack chance for all ranged attacks against the target by 25% and lasts for 6 seconds. It also staggers the enemy. So this is not just for Hawkeye. Obviously, if Black Widow was shooting at the same enemy, she could also target the head. And that's obviously, it's highlighting the enemy red there to let everybody know, hey, get crits on this spot right here, and we can deal damage and take out the enemy very quickly. Now, if you press triangle after parrying instead of square, you will do the rocket arrow. So it fires a rocket-propelled arrow which pins itself to the targets and sends them careening off into the air before detonating. Some enemies are immune to this, so like obviously some of the bigger enemies are not going to be affected by this, but this can still be a very powerful counter attack here. So high damage, high impact, medium stun, and the reaction to the enemy is to knock them back. Another very important thing is the locked on intrinsic ability upgrade here. So you attack enemies and you build up the overcharge meter. Filling that meter triggers the locked on buff, which enables locking onto enemies with ranged attacks by pressing L2. So like once you start aiming your bow and firing arrows, as you're seeing here, you're noticing that these enemies have like a little red crosshair on their head. So it's automatically locking onto their crit spots, and you can use the right sticks to sort of toggle between the different targets if you want to. And lock can be manually disengaged by clicking the right stick. Taking damage before the overcharge meter is full will drain all energy from the meter, and this ability lasts for 14 seconds. And it can be used, obviously it's being used here with the razor arrows, which is very powerful, but you can also use it with the cluster arrows. So that can be a really powerful thing. These are just general upgrades to your intrinsic ability. This extends your locked on buff by 2 seconds, so that puts it up to 16 seconds. That's pretty powerful. All right, so the boomerang arrow. This is an intrinsic attack here. Holding R2 and pressing square, you fire an arrow that travels in an arc. So as you see, it's kind of flying in a circle. It's hitting that enemy, going around the back of that column, and then Hawkeye catches it. But there's an upgrade here, where if you press square just after you catch the boomerang arrow, you can shoot it out again, and it ricochets between multiple targets. It breaks block, it's high damage, it causes enemies to fly back. This is a very powerful arrow. You can take out a horde of drones instantly. You can take out weak enemies, and then looking at our skill tree later, we're going to find a way to buff this attack, which is going to make it even more powerful. Now, holding R2 and pressing triangle instead of square is going to do the grapple arrow, which this is really great if you want to close the gap and get in close to an enemy. This breaks block, it's high damage, high impact, launches the enemy, so you can start doing this, which is the expert swordsman attack. So pressing triangle after performing swordsman prodigy, you follow up with another sword strike, which launches the enemy up in the air even more, which allows you to, you can either keep pressing triangle to like knock him down with a vertical slash, or you could try to keep him in the air by pressing square a few times. So this is very powerful. So obviously you see that there's like sort of an automatic slash there, and then you can follow up with this slash right here. So it's like you're getting in 2 slashes of triangle there, essentially. So that is sort of the basic play style here is Hawkeye. Of course, firing the boomerang arrow will showcase this more, but once you catch it, you just press square again. It's very easy. The grapple arrow kind of speaks for itself, but we will showcase that once we look at some of the other things in the skill tree. I want to showcase exactly what we're going to do in this build to change up these arrow types here. So we'll move on next to the specialty tree. Hey gamers, if you're finding this video helpful or informative, please give us a like. Much appreciated. Alright, so now we're going to look at Hawkeye's specialty tree. So Hawkeye's support heroic is the recovery arrow. It fires an arrow automatically downward. You don't get to aim this. It deploys nanobots over a local area, which recover willpower for any hero within range and duration of 10 seconds. Over here, we have the option to extend the duration by an additional 5. But I chose this. I chose critical care. All heroes affected by the nanobots have a 20% increased critical attack chance and 20% greater weak point and critical attack damage. So I figured people are going to like rally in the circle, be healing, and then trying to deal damage to all the enemies around them to kind of mitigate anyone getting downed. So I go for that. Unless we're like really struggling to stay alive. You can also do this. It provides heroes with a defensive barrier that absorbs 20% of incoming damage and reduces the impact of enemy attacks, the nanite shield. And I so happen to have a piece of gear here that we'll talk about later. It has a 14% chance to automatically activate nanite shield when taking damage, completely negating the attack. That's kind of a rare thing. I wouldn't really necessarily count on that, but that's certainly an option. At least now that we're talking about it, you can kind of understand what that is. On this side, we have increases the initial amount of willpower recovered by 75% and the amount recovered over time by 100%. Or you could do enemies defeated within the nanobot swarm area have a 30% chance to drop a heroic orb. If you're really struggling to keep the team alive, I would say go for the strong medicine. But I figured it might be nice to have everybody doing heroics and be able to regenerate my heroic and potentially use this ability more. Enemies defeated within the nanobot swarm have a 60% chance to drop an intrinsic orb. So if you really need your intrinsic energy for all these different attacks here, then you can certainly go for that, and that's obviously a very high chance that you're going to be getting intrinsic orbs. The assault heroic is called the Night Storm Arrow. You just hold R1 to target a bombardment zone, and then you release R1 when you got that area locked in, and it rains down multiple explosive projectiles over the designated area. It breaks block, it does high damage, high impact, medium stun, and staggers enemies. Just looking at this, you get a second charge of Night Storm, which is quite nice. Over here, you have some choices. You can do shock arrows, which I think are sort of good if you're looking to kind of like stun the enemies a little bit. You can do cryo arrows here, which it deals continuous damage to the enemies in the target zone for 5 seconds after the bombardment ends. So it kind of just creates this sort of lingering ice storm there, which is really cool. This one, the Fire Devil, I think is probably the most useful. Obviously, look at the Fire Tornado. I mean, look at that. That's obviously going to deal a lot of damage. And the reaction to this is that it launches enemies. So it creates a vortex of fire and it does plasma damage, which is really great. You can increase the size of the bombardment zone by 50%, but I figure the zone is fairly big on its own. You can usually cover a Dreadbot in that, and that's one of the bigger enemies, right? This increases the duration of the Night Storm Arrow's effect, dealing additional damage to enemies in the bombardment zone. So that means this little tornado here is going to be sticking around for a little while, which is good. You also have the option here to increase the status buildup for all damage dealt by the Night Storm Arrow by 30%. So, you know, depending on which type of status you're going with here, you can up that damage. Now, let's look at Hunter's Arrow. This fires an AI-driven smart arrow that seeks out targets and deals a large amount of damage as it pierces through them. We like to sort of say it's kind of like Yondu's arrow from Guardians of the Galaxy. It kind of has that arrow that auto-seeks enemies, and he just kind of whistles and commands it. This is kind of Hawkeye's form of that. Breaks block, high damage, high impact, medium stun, causes enemies to fly back. It can hit a maximum of 15 targets before running out of energy. Now you can up it to 20 with this upgrade, and if we look at our options here, you can fire 200 arrows charged with electricity, increasing the overall damage dealt and applying shock damage to all affected targets. So I do like to use this one on occasion, because as you notice, it's knocking these shielded enemies off balance and stunning them. There's the dive bomb arrow, which attaches an explosive charge each time it hits an enemy. Shooting the enemy or hitting them with a melee attack will detonate the charge. So this is really good if you want to go in there and melee the enemies as your hunter arrows doing things. But if you're going to be shooting arrows, it might be more pertinent to use the twin talons, because this one really heavily relies on you. Like, if you want to get that explosion damage by shooting the enemy or hitting them, you know, you want to get in there and do some attacks and stuff. So it's not necessarily a melee attack. Yeah, it says shooting or hitting. So interesting distinction there. Breaks block, high damage, high impact, low stun, launches enemies. It's pretty cool. Marked Prey. I think this one is really good for bosses. So basically, whichever enemy you're looking at, it's going to concentrate the damage on that enemy. So you notice it's putting a crosshair on one specific robot, and it's the one nearest Hawkeye right there. So if you were fighting a boss, this might be a good arrow to switch to if you want to just focus on one enemy. Or if you're just, even if you're fighting a group of enemies like this and you just want to choose which enemy you're focusing on, that can be very powerful. So yeah, I often switch a lot with this Heroic Ultimate ability, depending on the situation. So obviously firing 2 arrows can be really powerful as well. So I'll often switch between these two just based on what I want to do. Now over here, you can have it recover 5% willpower each time the hunter's arrow hits an enemy. So if you're low on health, this is another way that you can just regain some willpower. And Hawkeye is definitely a healing character, and his power for healing is really great, and so is Kamala's. Enemies defeated by the hunter's arrow have a 25% chance to drop a heroic orb. You know, that's all me. I love it. I love doing my heroics. I want to generate more opportunities to be able to do my heroic, especially if the team's in trouble and I want to use my support heroic to heal everybody. This third option here, the hunter's arrow taunt enemies it hits, drawing aggro away from nearby strike team members. That's up to you if you want to take all the aggro off the team. But I'm usually going with the heroic orb in this case. So that's my recommendation. You can switch this up as needed, just depending on the situation you're in and whether you want to focus more on healing or something else. So let's look at the mastery tree next. Hey gamers, if you're finding this video helpful or informative, please give us a like. Much appreciated. Alright, let's take a look at the mastery tree for Hawkeye. Now, starting off on the melee here, you can increase the stun damage of all melee attacks by 20%. That's usually something I like. I like to stun enemies so I can get takedowns. You can increase the critical attack chance for melee attacks by 15%. That can also be equally powerful. Increases the amount of the impact of the implosion arrow, which, remember, that's the one that we hold square or X if you're on Xbox, causing tougher enemies to be drawn into the area of effect. So this can be very powerful. That can be a good option for you. You can increase the damage of combo finishers by 15%. You can increase the damage of all sprint and dodge attacks by 20%. But I obviously opted to increase the damage inflicted by split shot arrows by 15%. And we will showcase that in a moment. I'm going to sort of wait until we get to the end of the mastery tree here to really showcase why I chose some of these perks here, just so we have a clear idea. Performing a takedown generates an intrinsic orb. I always go with heroic orbs because I want to be able to regen. You could always go with regen pack instead, or intrinsic if you're really looking to regenerate your intrinsic stuff quickly. Let's look at the range stuff. So the razor arrows are your basic arrows here. 10% additional bonus damage. Impact increased from low to medium. So right now, because I have gear that's supporting the cluster arrow and the pulsar arrow, I'm primarily choosing to do things that buff those arrow types. So obviously, increasing the stun damage of the cluster arrow is really great. So that's increasing that by 20%. You can reduce the time it takes to fully draw and charge pulsar arrows by 30%. This is a big difference because the pulsar arrows are really slow to draw because these are the explosive arrows that we get to manually detonate, right? So they're very slow to draw because they're big, heavy explosive arrows that you have to arc the shot with. But I'm kind of choosing to really buff the cluster arrows because that seems to be what I'm using most of the time. Here we have triggers a shockwave when firing a fully charged razor arrow that staggers nearby enemies. So if you're holding R2, that's going to make your razor arrow incredibly powerful. Increases the spread of tripwire shot, allowing it to affect more targets. So that's why my radius with the tripwire arrow is so big when I fully charge up the tripwire shot there. As opposed to the... So it's a cluster arrow when you're just firing a basic arrow. But when you're doing the tripwire shot, it's like... That's also what you use in Bag of Tricks, but it's also what we're using when we're fully charging up the arrow and then releasing it. A fully charged pulsar arrow will fire partially energized, triggering a larger explosion if detonated immediately. Continue aiming the charged pulsar arrow to fully energize it before firing. Requires stationary target and neutron blast to be effective. So it just depends what you have and what you prefer, what type of arrows you like the most. Now this perk I use it so much. I love this one. Each perfect draw shot, which remember, perfect draw is when the crosshair turns purple, flashes purple, midway through charging up the arrow, not charging it up all the way, but releasing it when it turns purple. Adds a marksman buff that increases range attack damage by 10%. It can be stacked up to 5 times for a short duration, though, so that's upping ranged attack damage by 50%. Missing a shot or failing to perform the perfect draw will clear all stacks. So this is obviously a high skill bonus here. And if you're getting crits, it's even crazier. But once again, just because of our current gear, I'm going with the cluster arrow. Increases damage inflicted by both regular and charged cluster arrows by 20%. That's very powerful. Detonating a fully energized pulsar arrow will trigger a quick implosion effect, pulling enemies into the blast radius of the arrow. That can be really powerful as well if you're using that type of arrow and you really enjoy it. I have cosmic cluster arrows and cosmic pulsar arrows. So if I wanted to, I could kind of mix and match and apply some of these perks, but I'm really a big fan of buffing the cluster arrows at this point. All right, so looking at the intrinsic stuff, return fire is really cool. So after you do a perfect dodge, you can press square or triangle to trigger the startling disruption or the rocket arrow. And just to be clear, the startling disruption is right here. That's the only way that Hawkeye does the disruptor arrow. And then this is what the rocket arrow looks like. So instead of burning your intrinsic energy after doing a parry and then pressing square or triangle, with this skill in the mastery tree, you would just press square or triangle after dodging, which is after pressing circle, right? So that can be a powerful perk. But right now, I choose to buff Boomerang Arrow. So now it's going to automatically target enemy weak points when fired, which inflicts additional damage on impact. Which means this arrow that's automatically circling through the environment and hitting as many enemies as possible, and then I press square once I catch it to shoot it off again. This is incredibly powerful right there. Using the swordsman's prodigy ability attaches an explosive charge that detonates after the attack. So this breaks block, it's high damage, high impact, medium stun, and launches the enemy. Swordsman's prodigy, just to be clear, it's this one right here. So that's the grapple arrow. So you could potentially buff that if that's something you want to do. I've chosen here to increase the base regeneration of intrinsic energy by 25%. I always prefer to do this rather than reducing the cost of intrinsic attacks by 20%, or reducing the charge penalty when you miss a counter and you get hit or something, stronger unblockable attacks by 50%. I think you need to learn, like, this is kind of a get good thing to me. You know, you can apply this at the beginning if you're really struggling to learn how to counter and stuff, but I think you should learn the hard way so that you sort of come to appreciate some of these perks here that might be better as you become more skilled. Now here, this increases the duration of the disruption buff on enemies by 50%. That can be very powerful. Increases the rocket arrow damage by 25%. So if you're doing a lot of parries and you're able to land either of these attacks, these can be really powerful, and especially this one, because everyone's going to be firing at that disruption arrow wherever it impacts, which is usually the enemy's head, because that's usually most enemies' weak spots, right? But this option here, 20% more stun damage to parried enemies, that's what I've been going with, just so I can get more takedowns, more heroic orbs. But this is something I could see myself easily switching out, and I often switch that to the disruption debuff, depending on what I'm trying to do. Looking at the overcharge, you can reduce the amount of the overcharge energy drain when taking damage by 25%. Effect stacks with similar skills, so that can be good. But like I said, this is kind of a get good thing. You should kind of learn the hard way, and you shouldn't necessarily need a perk like that. Increasing the amount of overcharge energy gained from all range critical attacks by 15%. This is very powerful. So if you're getting I don't know why I just did that, but if you're getting crits on enemies, then that could be very valuable. That could be a very powerful attack here. You can increase melee attack damage by 20% and ranged attack damage by 10% while overcharged. So this gives you some options. You're able to do whatever you want while you're overcharged. You're not necessarily bound to using your arrows, but it just depends. What do you want to do while you're overcharged? And I feel like more often than not, this might be the smarter choice, is to go with Archer's Choice. But I often switch between these because sometimes I get a little melee crazy. But since our ranged rating is so high, this will change that quite a bit. This will be really powerful. And I'm usually trying to, even when I'm firing things like the tripwire and the cluster arrow, I'm still trying to get crits. I'm still trying to aim for the head. And if I can line up that arrow where it horizontally goes across and and hits 3 or 4 enemies in the head, that's incredible. That's very powerful. Reduces the amount of overcharge energy drained when taking damage by 25%. Effect stacks. So, once again, these are things that make it easier when you are not quite as skilled and you're learning the character. This can be a nice little learning curve thing, but like I feel like you should skip this stuff and just put in the hard work and get really good with Hawkeye. Learn to parry, learn to dodge, learn to, use your attacks at the right time here. So this one here increases the amount of overcharge energy gained from all combo finishers by 10%. This can be very powerful because you can do your heavy combo finishers, like this one. You can do your light combo finisher. You can do the, I don't know why I always struggle to find it. Yeah, the heavy combo finisher right there. You can do those. Those can be incredibly powerful. This one, while overcharged, defeating enemies have a 15% chance to spawn heroic orbs. I really like that. Increase critical attack damage by 20% while overcharged. So now we got the range critical attacks by 15%, and then we have this extra 20% there. So that can stack. That can be really really great. Defeating enemies can reward 20% willpower here, which is just for you, which is, it can be nice. This is really good. I will often switch between the critical attack damage in this, but that's, you can increase the locked on buff duration when defeating enemies by 2 seconds. So if you're able to target a lot of enemies, and the locked on thing is going to automatically go for headshots, right? So if I kill a bunch of enemies, I could add 2, 4, 6, 8 seconds onto that. It can be very powerful. It can be a very good thing when fighting weak enemies. But this might be more resourceful in a variety of situations, and especially against a boss. So that's sort of a look at the mastery skill tree, but let's just quickly look at how good Bag of Tricks is and how good the tripwire shot is for dealing with large amounts of enemies here. So tripwire shot here, all these different arrows here doing cryo and cosmic damage with the pulsar and the tripwire arrows. Okay, right now we have the locked on bonus. It's going for 12 more seconds. So it looks like I tabbed out of it. So I didn't get the it's being weird, right? Oh, okay, now it's locking on. So even with the tripwire arrow, it's managing to lock on to these enemies. And see the spread on this and the knockdown damage. And see, Bag of Tricks is very powerful. And then having the Jarvis barrier here just makes it to where I can't be interrupted. So having about 15 seconds to work with the locked on buff can be really powerful. And look at all the cosmic damage I'm building up. Obviously these are very weak enemies, but this is just the best way to showcase that kind of spread, this kind of power. And see, the Jarvis barrier really protects me from all this explosive damage that these enemies would otherwise be able to do to me. And so next we can kind of talk about the gear, but even doing the aerial version, right? Look at that. Look at the blowback of all this damage here. And then using the implosion arrow to pull enemies in and kind of escape, and then use Bag of Tricks. You don't even have to sit here and like aim with your actual arrows at enemies here. So see, obviously it's waiting for that enemy there. This is obviously a tricky situation, but yeah, we were still able to get our crits there. So yeah, that's just a basic showcase of the build and why the things I chose in the mastery tree are so important. All right. So let's take a look at the gear. This is the stuff that we've been alluding to, and I've been sort of semi-explaining as we look through the skill tree. Looking at the sword here. Status damage type from melee gear is applied to intrinsic attacks. So that would be things like the boomerang arrow and the rocket arrow, right? The split shot arrow does cryo damage and 15% increased Archer's instinct energy. So it's going to apply cryo damage to our intrinsic attacks. And oh my gosh, okay, come on. Yeah. So thinking about the boomerang arrow, thinking about the grapple arrow. Sorry, I don't know why I said rocket arrow, but yeah, the grapple arrow. But yeah, I guess. Well, this doesn't really count as an. It's labeled as an attack, not necessarily. It is an intrinsic ability, so yeah, maybe it is. Maybe it's kind of that weird thing there. Okay. And then Archer's instinct here is this. That's our actual, like, sort of dodge parry type stuff that we have on our character. So this is very powerful. Increased Archer's instinct energy, which is our intrinsic bar. I guess that's just another name for that, essentially. The hive mind arrowheads. So this is the bread and butter of what makes the split shot arrow and the bag of tricks so special. And these are the arrows that we're just firing with triangle, right? Cluster arrows and pulsar arrows are dealing cosmic damage, 18% chance when hitting an enemy with a ranged critical attack, which we're doing all the time with our arrows, right? That's why I was constantly getting the Jarvis barrier just a second ago when I was fighting all those little basic robots, right? Because I was getting headshots all day. I had the locked on buff, which was helping me get headshots, and then I was doing the bag of tricks to just like clean up the room. And anytime they tried to hit me with something, whether it was gas or explosions or whatever, you know, my Jarvis barrier was just not today, not today. So other option we have here, this one does razor and pulsar, which means the tripwire arrow that is used during the bag of tricks wouldn't be here. So this is not quite as good, but it does have Tachyon Surge, so I chose to keep it. I think it's good. Now, this one could be good if I want to swap out the arrows that we're using in the bag of tricks with Gamma, because the cluster and the pulsar arrows, right? Over here we have minus 10% damage reduction while locked on is active. So that's really good because usually during locked on, you're focusing on locking on to these different enemies and getting headshots, and it can be hard to avoid damage. 14% chance to automatically activate the nanite shield when taking damage, completely negating the attack. Now, we talked about the nanite shield earlier, but just sort of a quick recap here. Yeah, this is the nanite shield. So this is an example of what it is. So you can either equip it here, or there's like a 14% chance that if an enemy hits me, the nanite shield might pop up and kind of save me. It's kind of a weird perk. Increases the projectiles fired by the split shot arrow and splintering fire by 2. So, bag of tricks right there. That's the split shot arrow, and splintering fire is up here. So instead of firing 2 split shot arrows, doing a lot more than 2, right? And see, we're making sure that we're dealing cryo and cosmic damage. So I could switch the arrows that are doing cosmic damage to Gamma if I want to. So this is a really powerful build so far. Activating Hunter's Arrow instantly boosts the overcharge meter. Locked on is triggered when fully overcharged. That's very powerful, right? Grants an extra Night Storm Arrow charge. So that means, I don't know if he'll show that. Yeah, so I have 1 charge of Night Storm Arrow in the bottom right corner with R1 there. And then I have 2 little dots above it. So that means I can do that one 3 times. It's absolutely insane what this bow adds to my build. Increases the number of targets Hunter's Arrow can hit by 3. So Some potential that we can do here if we go to this, was it the specialty tree? Yeah, it was. So this one here only uses like 1 arrow, for example, but this one uses 2. So I could potentially add 3 more shock arrows and make this incredible. So this one right here, we're just going from 1 arrow to adding even more. So it just depends what I want to do. But this bow, the Eagle's kit, this is very powerful. So that's adding 3 arrows, 300 arrows. Or no, 3 targets, sorry. Not extra arrows, 3 extra targets. So yeah, let me revise what I've just said here. Can't even read. But yeah, it's firing 2 arrows, and we're able to choose. I think it was in the mastery tree, I want to say, where it was. Was it in the mastery tree? Yikes! I hate it when I can't find stuff. There's so much to do with this. But yeah, I think the point stands here. So it's gonna hit 3. Actually, yeah, it is in the specialty tree. I think it's right here. Yeah, 15 targets before running out of energy. Now it raises it to 20, so now it's 23. So, you know, depending on which arrow I choose, it's gonna hit even more enemies. So 2 arrows hitting 23 enemies. That's pretty ridiculous, right? Or I could just have 1 arrow doing that. So it just depends. Possibly switching to that shock arrow might be really smart. This right here, heroic ultimate ability, charge rate is up by 7.8%. Same right here. Increased stun damage from sprint and dodge attacks. That's pretty good. I wanted the precision bonus that this particular ISO drops here. Right here we have a chance that taking damage grants the cosmic surge buff. Dealing damage while the buff is active restores a small amount of willpower and heroic energy. That can be a very powerful thing, even though it's a very small chance, like 14.3%. I prefer to use the Tactagon unless I'm like specifically dealing particle damage. Maybe I would switch to the Void Tech Transponder. But I want to get that status damage from all my arrows. I want to really buff that as much as I can. Another good idea to look out for is maybe some split shot arrows. Find some split shot arrows that do different types of damage, right? I have some that do vibranium, but if you find some that do sonic damage, those arrows will be on the enemies, and then they'll be putting out that sort of sonic field that restores your heroic energy. So that can be very powerful. Here I have split shot arrows do plasma damage, and light combo finishers are dealing plasma damage. So this sword is very powerful as well. It increases damage, stun, and status amounts by 15% while lock on is active. So it's making locked on even more powerful. So this is a good thing to switch out potentially, just depending on the situation and what type of damage I want to do to enemies. And I have an electric version of split shot arrow, so that's totally changing up my bag of tricks. You know, I can do cryo, I can do shock, I can do vibranium, I can do whatever. So it's really cool to find different types of arrows and even different types of swords and stuff. And of course, having different arrows here for pulsar and cluster arrows, that will change up your bag of tricks drastically, right? So those are my best tips at the moment as far as Hawkeye's gear goes. So if that makes sense, this can be a very powerful character that's very resourceful, can deal a lot of damage without even really, you don't really have to be good at aiming. With the locked on thing, it's automatically aiming at headshots. With Bag of Tricks, you're just spamming triangle to shoot off dozens and dozens of arrows. It's ridiculous. It's unfair. And that is what makes Hawkeye really special. And when you watch the Kate Bishop video, you know, you will see some similarities to what Hawkeye does, but Kate Bishop will very much differentiate herself. But Hawkeye has a lot of skill. He's shooting ridiculously large amounts of arrows. They're doing elemental damage. And he's also shooting a lot of arrows without looking, without properly, you know, like he's got all these things that allow you to automatically just be a boss at aiming at enemies, which Kate doesn't have. Kate has a different set of stuff. So he's a very skilled marksman, and the gameplay really showcases that. And even if you're not a particularly very skilled player, you can still maximize Hawkeye and be really good at him. So really cool here. So hopefully this has helped. That's my gear recommendations for Hawkeye. And that's all for this video. Hopefully you found it helpful or informative. If so, give us a like, and we'll see you on the next one.